How did we get here?
How did we get here? Black Reconstruction.
A vision for Black lives.
A vision for Black lives from 2016.
What white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it.
In our report, we condemned violence and lawlessness in the strongest terms, saying that, quote, they nourish repression, not justice.
So since the Kerner report, there has been a deepening or growing economic schism between trained and educated blacks and poor blacks.
I think it is going to be incumbent upon state and local governments to assert their rights and their authority and their power.
To me, the question isn't about the degrees of severity, which white supremacy is worse. The question is which forms of white supremacist governance is most damaging at a particular moment.
The Kerner Commission emphasized that the problems of criminal justice were inseparable from the problems of jobs, schools, housing, and institutional racism.
I think it's important to not individualize Trumpian politics on these issues, meaning to put him in a 50-year pattern of racial politics.
We need the white moderates to come be a part of this coalition, but we need them to be as invested in it as they are invested in their whiteness.
Our politicians have been asking the police to act as the violent arm of white racial fear. And so we can't understand mass incarceration without understanding this appeal to white violence.
Police departments are still driven by the 911 call machine. Supervisors are very rarely given the resources or the autonomy that they work on other things as well that involve getting out of the car, talking to neighbors, building relationships.
I don't think it's enough to say that we're gonna cap long sentences and we're going to enhance good time provisions, the kinds of things that we associate with criminal justice reform. I think that those are important. We also need to think about reparations for those very communities for the last 2 generations. And I think that that means investing in ways that go well above just changing laws so that we stop harassing people and stop treating them unfairly.
And too often what happens is when I see a controversial shooting or something go bad in policing, a lot of people will come out and say that the system has failed. And I also come back to them and go, no, actually it didn't. It did exactly what it was designed to do. The system that's in place is the system from the 40s and 50s. It's the system that ensured that police were the tool of oppression.
Anti-black attitudes are kind of like the air we breathe. For the average white person, an integrated neighborhood is 67% white. And remember, there's still a group of them who want something integrated, but that excludes blacks entirely.
Black families move 2 or 3 times in the suburbs often to keep their kids in good schools, and they never build equity because of steering, because of mortgage lending discrimination. They systematically buy high and sell low, just like they were doing in the 1960s, but it's more subtle.
And we say, here's a voucher, you can go use it anywhere. Well, actually, you can't use it anywhere. You can only use it where somebody, where it's charging a rent that we'll pay, and we won't pay very much. If you don't leave this here with anything else, do not be in a conversation for the rest of your lives, because it's going to take way past your lives, and it's gone past mine, that you're not raising this issue of racial justice in this country and the need for, you can call it reparations, I'm a lawyer, I call it damages, but we have got to keep that up front and center in every piece of this conversation.
How does rising black income inequality impact black politics? It's important because the way they pay the bills impacts social relationships and will then impact political capacity and political power. So the question isn't a falling graph. The question is, given that, how are people living?
As we've seen poverty grow in the suburbs and poor people of color move to the suburbs, what we're seeing in some ways is a resegregation. Concentrated poverty grew steeply in the 2000s, but it grew at the fastest pace. The incidence of high poverty neighborhoods, the growth of poor people living in high poverty neighborhoods happened at the fastest pace in suburbs.
Employers have really abused this ability to put workers into the wrong status. They've lost a lot of power. They've lost the right to form a union because all of a sudden now it's called collusion. If you're a bunch of independent contractors and you get together to talk about wages, that can be a violation of antitrust laws.
The spatial separation of whites and non-whites over these large distances simply would not have been possible without massive investments in highways.
We really now understand the mechanisms that are linking these poor environments to poor health outcomes. And so one of the environments is actually through health behaviors, but it's not because poor people behave badly, but instead they have constrained choices and options. And so therefore, having constrained choices creates a profile or sort of social norms around certain behaviors that are more a function of the environment than a function of those individual choices.
I think there's a lot of rhetoric around choice, but we have to understand that choice is based on privilege. When it was Black and brown people in inner cities who were dying, poor people who were dying, addiction was seen as a moral failing. Now it's white, suburban, rural, wealthy people who are dying. You can check yourself into a medical clinic because it's a disease. We don't acknowledge that violence is a public health issue, that poverty is a public health issue, that racism is a public health issue. Then we're not going to make progress on overdose, and we're not going to make progress as a society.
And we're in a situation where we have the most inequitably funded education system in the industrialized world. We have the largest number of children in poverty of any country in the industrialized world. We have doubled the number of children who are homeless in the last decade. You could fill every NFL stadium with homeless children and have some left over to sleep under the girders.
And so too often, our exclusive focus is on interpersonal experiences of racism, rather than a systems approach that considers structural racism. What we see is that the period in which we witnessed the greatest racial convergence in academic achievement and educational attainment coincided for earlier era cohorts first exposed to integrated schools and hospitals.
If we have systems set up to guarantee that Black and brown children do not get the same opportunity as their white counterparts, why is that acceptable? You overtest our young people, you narrow their curriculum. What should happen is that every child should have what works.
I definitely suggest that community anti-violence programs need to be developed. I believe that there needs to be a focus on leveraging power and the expertise of community members to patrol their own neighborhoods.
Indeed, cities today are, as ever, socially differentiated by neighborhood, a mosaic of social worlds. Lead toxicity is a pathway, really, through which racial inequality literally gets into the body. And I think collective efficacy, informal social control from the ground up, collective action on the part of residents matters and works.
We can do better to provide housing choice. We know how to do it. Programs in Baltimore, Mount Laurel, Montgomery County, Chicago, Dallas, and elsewhere show that we can successfully provide choice and opportunities for families who welcome them.
The truth is that we do not have deficits of ideas in this country. We have deficits of courage. We need a courageous Congress and White House that is willing to act. Every community in America feels the pain of Washington's lack of courage.
What allowed me and my sisters and brothers to make it was a sense in this country at the time, despite all our problems, that there was a value in public life. And when I think about it, my entire early life was supported by public goods and policy decisions designed to promote the public good. Our project must be premised on the understanding that ending our segregated lives is a matter of national democratic survival.
The fight for people's minds is one thing, the fight for people's hearts is another, and the use of culture is the strongest way to win people's hearts over.
When we talk about segregation, we're talking about segregation of opportunity, segregation of resources. So when people say, yes, but what if all the resources were equal? There'd be no reason to separate people. The whole purpose is to make resources unequal. So if we really had equal, we wouldn't have segregation. In some ways, you could say the Kerner Commission is the road not taken, but the road is still there.
We believe that all the policies and social norms reinforcing the dynamics between the two separate and unequal societies divided among racial lines stem from fear.
Why are you putting borders
Is this a country in which what seems unfamiliar is to be feared? What are you afraid of? What are you so determined to protect the United States from?
Elle and I explore how the language and ethos of growth and progression are loaded with justifications for state-sanctioned violence against Black and brown, queer, and trans communities. Violence including geographic displacement, environmental racism, and physical brutality.
You ain't traveled nowhere unless you live under the thumbtack of LAPD. See how only this swath of the county is policed by copter. But the question isn't, will we thrive in deficit? The question is how long? How long? How much more long?